From the 1800s to 1930, camp meetings were the most exciting community events in New Jersey's Sourland Mountain region. Organized annually by Skillman's Mount Zion AME Church, camp meetings were religious revivals and social gatherings that brought the entire community together from across the rural countryside. In 1975, the Princeton Recollector interviewed local residents who had attended the Skillman camp meetings more than 50 years before. The words you're about to hear come from the oral histories of May True, Howard and Sally Hoagland, Earl Hubbard, Sarah Blackwell Harris, and Leona Hubbard Stewart, as told to the Princeton Recollector. Their words are spoken by SSAAM leaders and descendants of the Sourland's Black founding families. The story starts in 1899, when Mount Zion AME Church was relocated from its original site on the Sourland Mountain to its current location on Hollow Road in Skillman, New Jersey.
At first, this little church was up at Zion. When they moved the church down here to Skillman, they asked the farmer, Tom Brophy, if they could have this little grove that had a brook running alongside of it for the meeting grounds. He just made them welcome to it, and that's where they had it for years. The farmer used to let his cows run there all summer, so up around where the preacher was and where the people sat, we had to take a shovel and clean up before the service began.
They advertised it by putting big posters on trees and telephone poles telling about the camp meeting. But every year people seemed to know about the time it came, and they just came on those Sundays. They looked forward to it every year. And all the horses and wagons would come in from the mountains and all around.
We'd go by train. 8 cents was the fare from Hopewell to Skillman. They'd put on extra cars because the people would come from all around. The train ran extra cars from Pennington and Trenton.
Everyone was welcome. They came from Princeton, Rocky Hill, Kingston, Pennington, Hopewell, Neshannock, Somerville, Belmead, and Trenton. From everywhere around. In later years, there were more white folks than colored people.
There was a feeling of the colored people and the white people together. The farmers that lived back there in those mountains never went to church. They were all country people out there, and they didn't go to church for nothing else.
Camp meetings were religious services, but they were also social events, and everyone who attended tried hard to look their best.
We'd sell chickens or geese or something to get money to buy all new clothes. It was a big deal, just like you were going to the president's ball. You had to look good at camp meeting.
Everybody got dressed up fancy. There were several big ladies. They looked real big because they had petticoats. And they always had big hats and a whole lot of false hair, their Sunday hair. My mom did it too. She had short hair and she put in things that looked like little puffs. They got dressed up to go to that camp meeting, let me tell you.
It was such a to-do at our house to get everybody clean. I had fancy dresses. We had a very fancy buggy with lights on each side. And we had Bill and Harry, 2 pretty horses who they used to clean. Oh, we were sharp.
Young fellas, even in their teens, would work to get a team of horses. One used to try to outdo the other. They'd have their horses, sorrel horses. They'd have their runabouts all washed and varnished. Oh, they were shiny. And they'd be driving them just like they did later with cars. A lot of us kids used to sit and watch the different ones come in. How the sun used to hit those spokes.
Mount Zion AME Church had a small congregation, so preparing Brophy's field for the camp meetings required everyone to pitch in.
There were no trains early enough to bring the minister who came up from Pennington, so Mr. Robinson would always go up and meet the trolley in Hopewell and bring the preacher because he had the horse and wagon.
They used to have an old pump organ. They'd load that thing up every Sunday. Spencer True had an old horse that didn't move so fast, and he'd take it down to the camp meeting grounds along about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. Take a good while in those days to get things done.
In the morning, the men would come out there and wash off the tables and put up the seats. Ben Grover, all those old folks worked for the farmers around there, and they knew the farmers. If they wanted a plank, well, this farmer had a plank, and that farmer had a plank, and they had tomato crates. And they'd put a plank from one crate to the next, and they'd have seats all the way around. You all sat on tomato crates.
The pulpit would be a box. They'd bring the pulpit down from the church and set it up on those boards. That would be the pulpit, and the choir used to sit up there too. They'd be singing with the organ.
Then the women doing the cooking would come in about 11 o'clock, and they'd start peeling the potatoes, and sometimes they'd have corn. All this stuff had to be gotten ready, no canned stuff, you know. They had big pots on the back of the stove, and the chickens were stewing in them.
Even half a century later, local residents remembered the church leaders who organized the camp meetings.
John Robinson was the boss of the camp meeting and was very much respected. He was very religious and used to make little prayers. He knew enough to read from Bible a little. He was a good old soul.
Mr. Robinson was an old slave who lived in Stoutsburg. He was a trustee of the church. He wasn't a preacher, but he was a good guy. In them days, it didn't make much difference whether you were a preacher or not, as long as you could say something about Jesus Christ.
He used to tell us some of his experiences. During the Civil War, he was nothing but a kid, and they had him washing and cleaning the dead soldiers. He said he was scared and everything else. It was an awful mess.
He was 5'5" or 6. He was muscular. He could take a 2-bushel bag of wheat in each hand and one in his teeth and walk across the barn floor. That's how rugged he was. Now Spencer True, he used to take up a 50-gallon barrel of cider and put it in the back of a Jagger wagon.
Mr. Robinson had a hard head. The kids used to have fun with him. He used to like kids and cut up with them. Sometimes he would catch us and take his head and butt our head. We'd have knots on our heads and headache.
John Robinson's wife, Hannah, was in charge of all the pies and baked goods sold at the camp meeting.
Mrs. Robinson saw to it that the pies were made. There were lemon pies and apple pies and peach pies. During the summer months, it would be easy to get those kind of pies. After the meeting was over, they would take the food and stuff to some of the people's homes. It had to be used up. This house was the old homestead. Mrs. Crindy True and her husband Spencer lived here, and people would come here and buy the pies.
Corinda True was a prominent figure at Mount Zion AME Church. In 1899, when the congregation's original church on the Sourland Mountain fell into disrepair, Corinda and her husband Spencer donated a piece of their 5-acre farm to build a new church on Hollow Road. Corinda True also helped with food for the camp meetings.
They had very nice meals, and I don't think they charged any more than $1. 50 cents for children and $1 for grown-ups. It was usually chicken and dumplings and corn on the ear and potatoes and succotash and chopped cabbage and pickled beets, a regular old farmer's meal. Mrs. Ben Grover was the one that did the cooking mostly. Crindy True usually washed dishes and peeled the potatoes and things like that.
There was a time they were making these dumplings and the women couldn't get them to raise. They were just as heavy as they could be, like putty. And I went in there. I'm not a chef, but I knew you couldn't cook dumplings in what they were trying to cook them in. So I said to an aunt of mine, old Aunt Crindy, "You can't cook dumplings in that grease." She said, "Oh, yes, I can." And I said, "Give me a pan." She gave me a pan and I threw some water in it, took 2 or 3 dippers of that chicken grease and threw it in there and put it on the stove. I put some salt in the grease and water and took some of the dumplings and threw them in, and my Lord, they swelled up about as big as your head, just that quick. They couldn't believe it.
We'd start eating about 1 o'clock. There were long tables and benches, and everybody'd be smacking and eating. Some of them hadn't eaten in a couple of days, and they were really hungry.
Then he would probably have a saucer of ice cream. In those days, it was all made by hand, and it was made out of cream. It wasn't made out of this artificial stuff like it is today, made out of real cow's cream and milk and sugar.
After lunch, visitors prepared for an afternoon of preaching and singing.
The service began about 3:30 and would go till about 5 or 5:30. The minister would take a sermon from any book in the Bible, and then he'd just read the first verse and take that for his text. And that's the way he'd go right on. Not long sermons, but though once in a while you'd get a long-winded minister that preached probably the same thing over and over just to prolong it. But as a rule, not over a half hour. Then the singing would begin about a half hour and then taking up the collection.
We used to have different ministers from different places. That's how it would be advertised in all the churches. Reverend Allen's going to speak, and then everybody'd come. The Sunday following that, it would be Reverend Jones from Hopewell. Then the third Sunday would be a big Sunday. Reverend Briggs from Princeton was going to preach. He was a great preacher. He'd set that place on fire.
I don't remember too many of the ministers, to tell you the truth, because when all is said and done, I was young back in those days, and I wasn't nearly as religious as I am now. I was out there to have fun, too.
We'd always have somebody come to play the organ, and then they'd start the service with the organ. They had preaching and singing. Mostly they sang old hymns like Amazing Grace. They had a lot of gospel singers. The choir would sing, and then the congregation would join in, too.
The only humorous thing was Spader. People used to like to see him sing because when he sang, he would make all manner of faces. It was really funny to see, but he was a good bass singer. He sang a solo with Billy Sunday's choir in Trenton. He'd roll his mouth up and make a roar. He had an awful heavy bass voice, and he could sing. Then he'd help take up the collection.
The most famous singer at the camp meeting was George Blackwell. George Blackwell was a descendant of Frost Blackwell, who had been enslaved in Hopewell in the early 1800s. Frost gained his freedom in 1818 and was able to purchase his wife Nancy Van Vactor's freedom as well.
George Blackwell was a short man. I would say not over 5'1", and he was sort of broad. He was a very religious man, but he was comical. He always had a joke. He and Spader used to sing duets together. They liked to get a laugh.
When they took up the collection, someone would holler to Uncle George Blackwell, "I'll give you $1 if you sing They Stole My Mother Away." You see, this old man, George Blackwell, he's the one they wanted to hear sing this, and people used to come from miles to hear him sing it. They'd start waving dollar bills. "You sing, They Stole My Mother Away."
Everybody was waiting for him to sing that. They were dying for him to sing that one. And how he would sing it, too. He was a great singer.
They Stole My Mother Away was an African-American spiritual from the time of slavery. Although many camp meeting attendees vividly remember George Blackwell singing when interviewed 50 years later, no one could remember the words to the whole song, only bits and pieces.
It's 1, 2, 3. Just listen what I tell. How many slaveholders made their beds in hell?
Oh, they stole my mother away. They stole my mother away. But Jesus said he'd find her in that coming day.
Like cattle we were sold, just as if we weren't human and hadn't a human soul.
And then he'd go on and sing the song with my sisters and my brother, my papa and my mother. Then some would say, "Uncle Pete, sing it again." And he'd go all over it again. They were crazy about that.
He saved that song till last so he could get some money for the minister that preached. And he'd go out there and he'd get himself more money on singing that piece than all the rest put together. Some of those old farmers would come in with dollar bills, and dollar bills were money, real money.
After the preaching and singing was done, visitors spent the evening socializing.
They would stay on nice Sundays when the sun was beginning to go down. After services, they'd flock around the ice cream and confectionery stands. If there were any pies left over, they'd buy them and sit around and socialize, like a harvest home. Different farmers from different parts. They'd meet there and talk about crops.
It meant a lot because people were always so happy to get together. Sometimes they wouldn't see one another from one year to the next. That's when I used to meet my friends.
But by 1930, the Skillman camp meeting tradition was dying out.
After a while, the younger ministers didn't approve of the camp meetings. They said it was too much work for them. They didn't think it meant so much.
We got a new minister here and he got thinking, we ought to charge them to come up here with cars. So they charged them 50 cents to park. That broke up the camp meeting because people figured if they run the camp meeting for money, they wouldn't give to the collection.
After they started charging for parking, the farmer said, I'm going to charge them for renting the woods now. You see, all things work together. That's how religion got commercialized. As long as they were doing it for the love of the Lord and the love of the people, not to make money, that was all right. But when you commercialized it, then everybody wants money after a bit. That made it a little harder because money wasn't as flourishing as it is in these days.
It's been nearly 100 years since the last Skillman camp meeting, but memories of the gatherings and the sense of community they inspired live on.
Everybody seemed to be joined together, just like brothers and sisters of the church. Everybody was just like one big family. They all took great interest in it. There was a feeling of the colored people and the white people together.
It was a very happy time for everybody.